Section 4. Unit 7, Understanding the Closing Disclosure Form. Lesson 1, Closing Disclosure Form, page 1. Lesson 2, Closing Disclosure Form, page 2. Lesson 3, Closing Disclosure Form, page 3. Lesson 4, Closing Disclosure Form, page 4. Lesson 5, Closing Disclosure Form, page 5. Lesson 6, Wrapping Up Additional Government Influence. Understanding the Closing Disclosure Form, page 5. The APR and tip amounts shown at the bottom of the loan calculations summary will be updated from the amounts disclosed on the loan estimate to reflect the terms of the legal obligation at consummation. The Other Disclosures section discloses certain consumer rights and responsibilities in relation to obtaining and paying back the loan. The Questions section offers the consumer's options for getting questions answered by the lender or making a complaint to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The relevant contact information for parties involved in the loan and the transaction are listed on this page. As stated on the page, signing the closing disclosure form only confirms that it was received. It doesn't obligate the consumer to accept the loan, nor is it consummation of the loan. Understanding the Closing Disclosure Form, page 4. This page of the closing disclosure explains certain features about the loan that the borrower should understand. If the loan has an adjustable rate or a balloon payment, this page will also include an adjustable payment table and/or an adjustable interest rate table at the bottom. These tables provide information about how loan payments or interest rates will change over the life of the loan. These tables should also appear on the loan estimate form if they're relevant to the loan. The escrow account section specifies whether an escrow account will be used in conjunction with the loan. Borrower costs are listed in the appropriate table of this section. These amounts are estimated because the property costs can change over time. The initial escrow payment is the same amount disclosed as the subtotal of the initial payment at closing on page 2 of the closing disclosure. The section on escrow accounts includes consumer education and cautions consumers about the property costs covered by the escrow account. Understanding the Closing Disclosure Form, page 3. The consumer should use this table to review the items and amounts that changed from the loan estimate, or revised loan estimate, if one were received. There's a legal limit on the amount that the total closing costs can change between the loan estimate and the closing disclosure. If the total closing costs exceed that limit, the lender must include a statement that discloses the amount of the excess in the Did This Change? column. If this occurs, the borrower should verify whether a credit applies and is being provided by the lender. Loan estimate amounts repeat what was on the borrower's loan estimate, or revised loan estimate, form. Final amounts are calculated using the amounts disclosed on the closing disclosure form, or determined at consummation. If an amount is changed from the loan estimate to the closing disclosure, the right-hand column will show yes and will indicate where the borrower can find the amounts that have changed on the loan estimate or closing disclosure form. Earnest money that may be held by the broker in a trust account is shown as a credit under deposit. The amount shown under the final column for cash to close will match the cash to close amount shown on page 1 of the closing disclosure. The borrower's transaction table discloses the amounts associated with the transaction for which the buyer is responsible. The due from borrowers pay at closing. The seller's transaction table is completed by the settlement agent. It discloses the amounts associated with the transaction that the seller will pay and receive, usually resulting in a total cash to seller. The due to seller at closing section lists transaction-related amounts that the seller will receive as a result of the transaction. The left column lists transaction-related amounts that the borrower/buyer has already paid, or that have been paid on the borrower/buyer's behalf. The right column lists transaction-related amounts that the seller must pay in order to complete the transaction. Totals from the left table are calculated and result in an amount due from or to the borrower, indicated by marking a checkbox. This will match the cash to close amount shown on page 1 of the closing disclosure. Totals from the right table are calculated and result in an amount due from or to the seller, indicated by marking a checkbox. Understanding the Closing Disclosure Form, page 2. This page itemizes the amounts that contribute to the total closing costs shown on page 1 of the closing disclosure. All costs are shown in terms of who pays them, buyer, seller, or other, and when they're paid, before or at closing. If both the buyer and seller both pay for an item, the total amount is divided appropriately between the columns for that row. Loan costs. This page itemizes the amounts that contribute to the total closing costs shown on page 1 of the closing disclosure. All costs are shown in terms of who pays them, buyer, seller, or other, and when they're paid, before or at closing. If both the buyer and seller both pay for an item, the total amount is divided appropriately between the columns for that row. Services borrower did not shop for. Services that the borrower could have shopped for, but did not, will appear in the Services Borrower Did Not Shop For section, regardless of where the item was disclosed on the loan estimate. If the borrower used a service provider from the creditor's written list of providers, that item will appear in the Services Borrower Did Not Shop For section. Items are listed in alphabetical order, so they may not be in the same order as listed on the loan estimate. Total loan costs. All of the borrower's loan costs are totaled here. Costs paid by seller or others aren't included. Other costs. Amounts shown in the Other Costs section should generally match the costs shown in the consumer's loan estimate. Some updates are allowed to reflect adjustments due to the terms of the borrower's legal obligation at consummation. Taxes and other government fees. Total amounts listed as paid by borrower under taxes and other government fees should match the amounts shown on the loan estimate. The closing disclosure also lists amounts paid by the seller, such as all or a portion of the transfer tax. Prepaids. The items listed under prepaids are paid before the first scheduled payment of the loan. No more than 7 items are allowed in this section. For each item that is included, the applicable time period covered by the amount paid must be shown, for example, 12 months of an insurance premium. Initial escrow payment at closing. Initial escrow payments are paid to open the escrow account. This amount may change between the loan estimate and the closing disclosure. The last item, aggregate adjustment, will be 0 or a negative amount. Other. Items listed under Other will show costs the buyer or seller must pay related to the closing, but that aren't required to obtain the loan, so weren't required to be disclosed on the loan estimate. Total other costs, borrower paid. The total amount of borrower paid other costs is shown. Seller paid and paid by others columns aren't totaled here. The total closing costs paid by the borrower are calculated, including any lender credits. This amount is itemized according to costs paid at closing or before closing on the closing costs subtotals line, which also totals amounts paid by the seller or others. Lender credits, if any, are shown in the last line. These are general lender credits. Any charges specifically listed that the lender paid should be designated with the item under paid by others. An L listed with the amount indicates that the creditor pays the item at consummation. Understanding the closing disclosure form, page 1. Clients should check the closing information, transaction information and loan information for accuracy and agreement with the loan estimate. The MIC hashtag is a mortgage insurance case number, which may be required by the creditor. If misspellings or other errors are discovered, the client should contact the lender right away. Clients should check the information in the loan terms section to ensure that it's what they expected. If the loan estimate showed that the interest rate was not locked, the interest rate can be different than the one shown on the loan estimate. Even if the rate were locked, if there were changes to the client's application information, or if the closing doesn't happen within the rate lock timeframe, the interest rate can change. If the rate on the loan was not locked and locking the rate resulted in a fee to the client should have received a revised loan estimate form with this information. Otherwise, this information should contain the same information disclosed on the loan estimate, updated to reflect the terms of the borrower's legal obligation at consummation, that is, when the borrower signs the note. This section should contain the same information disclosed on the loan estimate, updated to reflect the terms of the borrower's legal obligation at consummation, when the borrower signs the note. This section provides the consumer with a summary of closing costs that are itemized later in the document. Cash to close is the estimated amount of cash the consumer will pay at, or receive from, closing.